When he saw the crimson stains marring the snow at the foot of the wooden cross, his vision blurred, because he knew this was no accident. Harlan trudged through the drifts toward the grave of his old hunting partner. The forest lay silent beneath an iron sky, each breath crystallizing in the frigid air. He'd visited this spot every winter since Sam's passing, laying fresh pine boughs, whispering old jokes into the stillness. Today felt no different, until those tracks appeared. Fresh pawprints led through the glistening white, each print edged with bright drops of blood. His heart thundered in his chest as he followed them, crunching through powder until he stood before the grave marker. A simple cross, its wood worn by storms and time, now bore witness to something he never expected. Nestled against the base of the cross lay a red fox, its russet fur matted with blood. She was wounded, flank torn open, yet she didn't flee. Her amber eyes were half-lidded, as if weary of flight, and she lay pressed against the cold wood as though seeking comfort. Harlan froze. He dared not breathe. He was certain the fox would spring away at any moment, any sane creature would. But she stayed, every labored exhale stirring little clouds of steam into the frigid morning. He remembered the stories Sam had told, how, years ago, a young fox had limped into camp with a shattered leg, moving so gingerly he'd thought it was a hallucination. Sam had carried her back to that very clearing, splinted her leg, and nursed her through weeks of fever and frostbite. When she finally limped off into the trees, Sam swore she looked back once and nodded. Harlan had laughed then. A fox, nodding. Ridiculous. But now, watching this injured creature lie at Sam's grave, he felt the laughter die in his throat. He crouched, every muscle taut, and reached out a hand. The fox lifted her head, her gaze fixing on him with a strange recognition, as though she knew exactly who he was. His pulse hammered inside his ears. The wind sighed through the pines, and he sensed the forest itself holding its breath. He remembered Sam's voice, they remember kindness. He had believed it as a boy, half convinced. Now he understood it was a truth far stranger than any myth. He dared to touch her flank, felt the ragged wound beneath his gloved fingers. His breath caught, blood, ice-cold, seeped beneath his glove. The fox winced but did not pull away. Instead, she closed her eyes, leaning into his hand. He swallowed hard, his throat raw. Then she opened her eyes again and peered into his face, as if trying to say something beyond words. Something that trembled between creature and man, gratitude, sorrow, farewell. Harlan stood, respect and awe overcoming any fear. He felt as if he had stepped beyond the bounds of everyday life, into a realm where wildness and grace intertwined. But the air was bitter, and he shivered. Gently, he drew back. The fox's breathing slowed. She pressed her head against the snowy ground, still nestled against the cross. He couldn't tear his eyes away. He thought, surely she will rise. She must. This is where the living go to rest, not the dying. He imagined her gathering strength, pushing herself upright, then slipping into the forest like the ghost of every fox that had ever prowled these woods. He exhaled a shaky sigh. Go on, he whispered, voice cracking. Go on home. But she did not move. The forest remained hushed, the snow untouched around her. The bloodstains at her side glowed against the white, and her chest rose and fell with a fragile rhythm. Harlan closed his eyes, grief and wonder warring in his heart. He opened them again and took a step backward. He expected then to see the fox disappear into the trees, leaving only her prints and the memory of kindness behind. But she sank deeper into the snow instead, as if the cold ground were pulling her down into the earth itself. He watched, breath caught in his throat, as her body settled, the last of her warmth fading into the pale light. And Harlan realized that this moment was not a beginning or an end, but a bridge between what was lost and what remains. He let out a long, ragged breath, the only sound in that frozen clearing. He thought it would be over then. But it was only just beginning. He stood a dozen paces away, the frozen ground cracking beneath his boots, and watched the fox as she lay curled beside the cross. Dawn's pale light filtered through skeletal boughs, haloing her wounded form in a fragile glow. Harlan's breath churned in ragged clouds. He dared not move closer, afraid that a single misstep, a stray creak of leather, would send her fleeing or, worse, cause her final breath to catch. He let memories rise, unbidden. Years ago, Sam had returned from one of his solitary hunts carrying something small and trembling against his coat. Harlan remembered the look Sam wore that day, part pity, part resolve. They'd thought it some woodland cub, until Sam knelt and unwrapped the cloth to reveal a fox kit, one hind leg twisted unnaturally, its fur matted with dried blood. Sam's rifle had slung at his shoulder, finger grazing the trigger. He cocked his head, closed his eyes, then shivered and lowered the gun. "I can't," he'd whispered, voice hoarse. "Can't end it like this." The two of them built a makeshift splint from saplings and twine. For nights on end, Sam stayed by the fire, warming the creature with his hand, humming old hunting songs, feeding it broth from a tin cup. Harlan was skeptical at first. He'd seen enough cruelty in those woods to know that wild animals rarely survived close encounters with people. But the kit's eyes, amber and unflinching, had seemed to hold a spark of something untamed and grateful. When the leg healed enough, Sam wrapped the fox in a blanket and carried her to the edge of the clearing. The forest held its breath as he knelt, set her down, and stepped back. The kit sat on a moss-covered rock as if in judgment, tail flicking slowly. Then, in one graceful movement, she turned and vanished into the pines. But she did not vanish far. Day after day, Sam spotted her at dawn, perched on that same rock, watching him with those knowing eyes. She became his silent companion, a guardian spirit of sorts. Harlan had teased him about it, "Your fox friend," he'd said with a grin. But Sam only smiled back, as if Harlan could never understand. Could it be the same one? Harlan whispered to himself now, voice cracking in the cold air. The years had been cruel to him both, Sam taken too soon by heart trouble, and now Harlan's own joint stiff with age and regret. Yet there was something undeniably familiar in the fox's posture, the slow lift of her head when the sun cleared the horizon. He stepped forward, every muscle taut, and dropped to one knee in the snow. His gloved hand hovered over his heart as though expecting it to shatter. The fox watched him, unflinching. Recognition seemed to burn between them, though she had no reason to know him. Stillness held them in a shared moment, man and beast bound by memories neither could fully name. Night fell and the temperature plunged, but sleep eluded Harlan. He lay by the stove in his cabin, images of the cross and the fox's weary eyes dancing behind his eyelids. He dozed in hours-long fits, jolting awake to the howl of wind or the snap of a distant branch. Each time he roused, his heart pounded with the fear that the fox might not still be there when morning came. At first light, he donned his coat and stepped outside. The sky was a sheet of dirty white, and the breath of dawn hung sharp on his tongue. He followed the narrow path through the snow. Every step, he braced himself, certain that the glade would be empty, the scene a trick of last night's fevered mind. But there she waited, as before, curled beside the cross, her flanks still crimson. Her eyes lifted when he approached, and in that gaze lay a depth of understanding that crushed his skepticism. He dropped to his knees a frozen foot from her side, and his voice trembled as he spoke. "I thought it was just a dream," he said. "But see for yourself, here I am, back again." She blinked slowly, ear twitching, as if weighing his words. She did not shift. Did not flee. She remained, body pressed to the cold earth, trusting a human to come near once more. He reached out, fingers brushing snow before touching the fur atop her head. It was rough and cold, but real. Tears burned behind his eyes, tears for Sam, for the fox, for the miracle of their reunion. He remembered every laugh Sam had shared, every tender moment tending that injured kit. He thought of how the fox had repaid Sam's kindness with loyalty and presence, unspoken but undeniable. "I should take you back to the cabin," he murmured. "Let you rest by the fire like he did." But she lifted her head higher, eyes fixed on the cross, then looked to him. Her lips parted in a soft exhale, and he felt the weight of her gratitude. It seemed she was saying, "No. This is where I must stay." He bowed his head, accepting her decision. Some bonds transcended years, distance, even death. In that silent vow, Harlan understood that the fox's vigil was not over. It was only beginning, the next chapter in a story of compassion, memory, and the wild wisdom that binds us all. He rose slowly, casting one last look at the fox, and turned back toward home, knowing sleep might yet find him. But one thing was certain, he would return tomorrow. And the day after. Because the promise they shared, of kindness repaid, could not be broken by time or frost. And he, Harlan, would bear witness until her final breath. I decided it must have been a trick of the light. But when I stepped into the clearing at dawn, there she was, waiting still. On the second day, dawn arrived pale and brittle, the sky a wash of pewter over the silent woods. Harlan crept from his cabin before sunrise, each breath a plume of smoke in the still air. The clearing lay just as he'd left it, the cross standing sentinel over its snowy tomb, and the fox, curled against its base, her russet fur dulled by frost and blood. He paused at the edge of the clearing, the cold biting through his layers. The fox did not stir. Yet her eyes, those fierce, amber eyes, remained wide open, fixed on the grave marker. They glimmered with life, and, for a moment, Harlan felt the weight of her gaze press into him. She knew he was there. He slipped a bit forward, pulling 2 tins of sardines from his pack. He set one on a flat stone 30 feet away and the other closer, within a few paces of where the fox lay. The tin clinked softly in the hush. He stepped back, heart hammering, and watched her. For a long minute she refused the nearer tin, her head barely lifting. Then, with an effort that made her wince, she shifted forward and sniffed. Her ribs flexed beneath her matted coat. She ate sparingly, just a few fish at a time, then paused, drawing breath, every exhale a whisper of steam. Harlan swallowed and edged forward another several paces, crouching low in the snow. He kept his movements deliberate, respectful of the fragile truce between them. The fox glanced up, her gaze sliding to him and back to the tin. Recognition flickered in her eyes, as though she remembered the taste of kindness from years ago. He recalled Sam's first act of mercy, how, during one bitter winter night, the hunter had found a tiny fox kit limping toward a frozen stream. Its leg was mangled, blood caked in fur. Sam had knelt, his hands gentle as a mother's, and carried the kit back to camp. By the firelight, he had cleaned the wound, set a splint from saplings, and stayed up through the night, singing lullabies in a rough voice until the kit's breathing slowed to soft rhythms. Harlan had teased Sam about befriending a wild creature. Yet as days passed, the kit returned, sometimes a cautious glimpse at the edge of camp, other times bold enough to sit on a rock and watch Sam tend the fires and mend his nets. When the fox finally vanished, Sam had said she nodded goodbye before slipping into the pines. Now, more than a decade later, Harlan felt that same unmistakable spirit woven into the fabric of this wounded creature. The fox ate slowly, glancing at him each time she lifted her head. As the sun climbed, the feast diminished. She ate until her pain no longer allowed movement, then sank back to the snow, watching Harlan as he rose to his feet. He bowed his head, placing a hand over his heart, before turning and retreating toward the tree line. He paused by the cabin door and looked back. The fox lay motionless once more, her body curled tightly against the cross, as if drawing strength from its wooden embrace. He stepped inside and warmed himself by the stove, hands cupped around a mug of broth. Sleep remained elusive. His mind replayed the morning scene in a loop, the fox's cautious approach, the flicker of memory in her eyes, the way she nuzzled the tin before eating. He felt as though Sam's spirit hovered between them, guiding his every careful move. Night fell again, and Harlan sat by the window, drinking tea. Moonlight silvered the snow. His gaze drifted to the clearing, empty now but for the cross. Then he saw her emerge, slinking through the trees with deliberate grace, her body low. She halted at the edge of the grave, lifted her head, and studied the cross as though reading an ancient script. The wind carried the faint sound of her breath. She lingered there, unmoving, her silhouette thin against the moonlit snow. Harlan watched from the window, leaning so close the glass fogged beneath his brow. In that pale light, the contours of her face shone with quiet determination. He felt tears prick his eyes. When she finally turned and vanished into the dark, she left no tracks behind, not even in the fresh snow. The clearing lay untouched, the cross standing lonely against the night. Harlan closed the curtain, his heart pounding with wonder and worry. He wrapped himself in a blanket and tried to rest, but his thoughts circled back again and again to that silent vigil under the moon. He wondered how many nights the fox would return, what message she carried, and what bond tied her so irrevocably to this place. He dreamed of Sam, of that first winter's mercy, of the fox kit curled in Sam's lap, eyes bright with gratitude. He woke with a start, the room cold, and thought he heard a soft scuffle outside his door. At dawn he dressed and stepped onto the porch. The clearing lay before him, pristine and empty, no fox, no tracks, no blood. He felt his breath catch in his throat. Had it all been a waking dream? Had the fox's spirit simply been a mirage of grief and memory? He took a step forward, then another, until he stood at the threshold of the clearing. Snow glowed pink in the early light, and the cross cast a long shadow. But the fox was gone. Harlan shook his head, rubbing frost from his brow. He told himself it was over, that perhaps the fox had found rest elsewhere. But deep inside, he could not relinquish the certainty that she would be back. "I thought maybe she'd vanished at last," he murmured. But on the third day, on the third morning, a gale shrieked through the pines, whipping snow into frenzied spirals. The world beyond Harlan's cabin was buried under a shifting veil of white, yet in the heart of the clearing she remained, unyielding, silent, resolute. He fought his way along the beaten path, snow clawing at his boots, wind tearing at his coat. His breath came in ragged bursts, but his eyes were fixed on the cross. There, curled tight against its base, lay the fox, fur spattered with frost, blood dark beneath the ice. He paused 20 paces away, the roar of the storm muffling thought, and for a moment felt the weight of the entire forest pressing in. Then he took another step and another, until he came within arm's reach. He sank to the snow on one knee, wind buffeting him, and dared to speak. "I didn't think," his voice cracked on a gale-driven gust. "I didn't think you'd still be here." The fox lifted her head, ear pressed forward, her amber eyes tracking his every move. She did not growl or whimper. She did not even hobble away. She simply shifted to face him fully, as though recognizing a companion who had come to honor their vow. Harlan felt a tremor through his core, fear warred with awe. Part of him wanted to turn and flee, to leave this impossible scene behind. But a deeper part, some sacred remnant of wonder, kept him rooted to the spot. It felt as though he stood on holy ground. He remembered Sam's gentle hands on that broken kit, the care he'd lavished when the rest of the world would have shrugged and walked on. He remembered how the fox had repaid that kindness with unwavering loyalty, how she had returned day after day, no matter the season. And now, here she was again, drawn not by hunger, not by fear, but by something far older and stranger. Harlan's heart pounded. 100 voices in his head argued, "She's dying, help her, yet she came here for another reason. He laid a gloved hand on her shoulder but stopped himself from touching the wound. He could heal her no more. She did not ask for healing. She asked for remembrance. He sat down carefully in the snow, side by side with the fox. Ice lanced his skin through his clothing, but he did not move. She cocked her head and gazed at him with such stillness that he felt tears sting his eyes. He swallowed past the lump in his throat. "I don't know what to do," he whispered. "I could build a fire. Bring blankets. You could rest inside like old times." His cheek brushed a dribble of snow. "But you came here, not for warmth." The fox closed her eyes for a moment, as if in relief. When she opened them, she looked past Harlan to the cross itself, half buried in drifts. He followed her gaze and wondered if he had mistaken the forest for a chapel, the storm for canticles. He watched the wind scour her flank, wondered how much time she had left. Yet she sat without complaint, unmoving, an emblem of quiet dignity in the heart of the storm. Reluctantly, he rose to his feet. I'll let you be," he said, voice low. "I'll come back tonight." He backed away slowly, never taking his eyes from her. Behind him, the wind howled its mournful farewell. By evening, the storm had spent itself. Harlan crept back along the path, shoulders hunched against the slush and chill. He entered the clearing under a sky smeared with blood-red clouds. The cross loomed as always, and the fox lay in its shadow, body stark against the snow. He approached once more and knelt. The silence between them was charged, electric with unspoken understanding. She lifted her head briefly, then settled it back against the snow. He pressed his palm to his heart, closed his eyes. In that breathless instant, he felt the forest pulse around him, the heartbeat of snow-laden branches, the hush of ancestral stones, the faint echo of a fox's footfall long ago. He stood, brushing snow from his coat, and whispered, "I'll see you tomorrow." He left without looking back. He thought this was it. But on the fourth morning, a brittle hush lay over the forest. Harlan stepped outside his cabin, expecting to find the clearing still lit by dawn's pale glow, and a fox curled beside the cross. Instead, he found only snow untouched, smooth as glass. He frowned, heart tightening. He followed the footprints he'd come to know so well, boot prints from his cabin door, then the faint impressions of a fox's paws, weaving toward the trees, then suddenly vanishing. The snow beyond was pristine, as though no passage had ever occurred. He bent to inspect the trail. The paw prints led 12 paces into the underbrush and then stopped, as though the fox had been pulled underground. He stood and peered among the trunks, hearing only the wind rattling brittle branches. "Where did you go?" he whispered. His voice seemed to echo, a plea cast into empty air. He searched until the path of footprints was lost, then turned back toward the clearing, breath billowing in the cold. All day he waited in the cabin, staring out the frost-frosted window. Memories of the previous nights flared in his mind, the fox's steadfast vigil, her wounded body pressed against the cross, her eyes burning with resolve. He paced until his boots thudded hollowly on the floor. Hunger gnawed at him, but he could not find tears to taste on his tongue, only worry and a sense of betrayal by the forest itself. As dusk bled into night, he donned his coat and set out once more, lantern in hand. The woods seemed endless, each tree a silent sentry hiding secrets. When he reached the clearing, the circle of snow lay undisturbed, the cross stark against the dim sky. He set the lantern on a rock and called softly, "I thought you were gone for good." His voice carried across the snow, then died away. He knelt and brushed his gloved hand across the footprints of the night before. Nothing. No scent of fox, no hint of life. Fighting despair, Harlan stared into the gathering darkness. Then, beyond the cross, a shape moved. He froze, heart pounding, and watched as the fox stepped into the faint lantern glow. She held something in her jaws. His breath caught. She looked at him for an instant, eyes gleaming with that same silent knowing, then dipped her head and placed the object at the foot of the cross. Harlan rose, lantern trembling in his hand. He stepped closer. There, half buried in snow, lay a small white flower. Its petals were pristine, as though plucked only hours before from somewhere deep within the woods. He knelt and gingerly picked it up. It felt warm against his glove, impossibly vibrant amid the cold and decay. He pressed it to his chest. The fox remained motionless, watching him. Her breathing was slow, deliberate. He realized she must have carried that flower all the way from some hidden grove, braving her pain and the bitter cold to leave this gift. He closed his eyes, letting the warmth of the bloom spread through him. "I can't explain this," he murmured. "But I saw it with my own eyes." He stood and held the flower before the cross, placing it gently on the snow. In that moment, the world seemed to pause, snowflakes drifted like soft applause, the wind stilled, even the trees leaned in. All that remained was the fox's steady presence. Harlan faced her, voice cracking with awe. "I thought this was farewell," he whispered. "I thought you were gone." She lifted her head, amber eyes reflecting the lantern's glow, as though acknowledging his words. Then, without another glance, she turned and padded back toward the shadowed tree lean. Her footprints reappeared in the snow, leading away once more, then stopped at its edge, where only darkness awaited. He watched until she vanished. The flower lay bright and impossible in the snow at the foot of the cross. He knelt once more and bowed his head, overwhelmed by the fox's quiet devotion and the mystery of her gift. The lantern flickered, throwing dancing shadows across the clearing. Sweat chilled on his brow. His legs ached from kneeling. Yet he could not rise. He pressed his palm to the cold wood of the cross, feeling every knot and grain. "Thank you," he breathed. "For everything." Behind him, the wind sighed, a sound like a whisper of approval. He turned and limped back toward the cabin, the small white flower cradled like a miracle in his hand. He told himself this was the end of her vigil, the final token of remembrance, the last sign of her gratitude. But deep in his chest, Harlan knew it was not over. "I thought this was farewell," he repeated softly to the night air, but this was not all. On the fifth night, Harlan lay awake in his cabin, the wood stove's embers dimming to ash. His eyes were heavy but sleep refused to come. Instead, he found himself drawn to the window, where pale moonlight pooled on the snow like liquid silver. He watched the clearing, heart pounding with a restless hope that tonight the fox would return. Hours stretched thin. The wind had fallen silent, and even the trees seemed to hold their breath. Then, just before midnight, he saw her, a dark shape slipping through the pines. The fox moved with careful grace, as though she carried the weight of every memory in her bones. He watched her approach the grave, each step measured, each footprint a testament to her devotion. She settled beside the wooden cross with a soft exhalation that stirred the snow at her muzzle. She lay low, ribs rising and falling in the cold night air, eyes fixed on the memorial. To Harlan's unseeing gaze, it must have looked like a woman kneeling at a loved one's headstone, seeking solace in the silent communion of loss. Harlan opened the door without a sound, the cold biting at his face. He carried no lantern, he would not break this moment with light. He stepped into the snow and sat a respectful distance from her, knees drawn to his chest. Night deepened around them, wrapping them in hushed reverence. They shared the clearing like old friends reunited. Neither spoke. Neither moved. She did not huff or shift, she simply lay there as if her life depended on guarding this spot. And he did not stand or leave, he remained, rooted by something he could neither name nor refuse. The stillness pressed in so heavily that Harlan felt his own heartbeat echo in his ears. He thought of Sam, of the many nights they'd sat by the fire under this very sky, talking quietly of hunts and the odd miracle of a creature spared by mercy. He thought, too, of the fox Kit whose leg had been mended by human hands, and how that small act of kindness had rippled through years and seasons until it brought this wounded creature back to this hallowed ground. Harlan's breath trembled as he looked at her. In her eyes there was so much silence, an ocean of memories, of pain, of faith. She was both fragile and unbreakable, a paradox of nature's cruelty and compassion intertwined. And at that moment, he could no longer hold himself together. A single tear escaped down his cheek, carving a warm path through frost. He bowed his head, pressing his gloved hand to the earth between them. "I'm sorry," he whispered, voice thick with emotion. "I wish I could do more." The fox lifted her head, amber eyes glinting in the moonlight. She regarded him for a long beat, then lowered her muzzle to the snow once more. In that silent exchange, Harlan understood that her vigil was not born of sight or hunger, but of something deeper, a promise kept beyond the boundaries of life and death. He sat until the stars began to pale with dawn's approach, until the first fragile light brushed the horizon. Then, with his back stiff from the cold and his heart full of awe, he rose. He did not disturb her. He merely stepped away, casting one last glance over his shoulder. The fox remained where she lay, a silent guardian of memory and grace. As he crossed the threshold of his cabin, he thought this might be the final night of their shared vigil. But he knew, deep in his bones, that it was not yet over. On the sixth morning, the forest lay empty and still. Harlan rose before dawn, heart heavy with the memory of the fox's steady vigil. He stepped onto the porch of his cabin, expecting to see her silhouette curled beneath the familiar wooden cross. Instead, he found nothing but unbroken snow and silence. All day he wandered the edge of the clearing, eyes scanning for any sign of her, no tracks, no movement, no whisper of rustling fur. His chest felt hollow, as though a piece of him had been torn away. At nightfall, he kept watch through the window, but the moon rose and set without revealing her shape. On the seventh morning, the same emptiness greeted him. The world felt colder, the trees more distant. Harlan's breath shook as he trudged toward the grave. The snow crunched underfoot, echoing in the still air. He nearly stumbled over his own shoelaces as he neared the clearing and froze at what he saw. Fresh pawprints led from the forest edge to the cross, and small droplets of blood stained the snow, her blood. He knelt beside the tracks, trailing them with a trembling finger until they ended. His eyes blurred with tears as he realized, this was her final journey. He stood and surveyed the clearing. The cross stood sentinel over an empty bed of snow, unmarred except for those brief footprints. No body lay there. No sign of struggle. Only the hollow space where her vigil had unfolded. A hush settled over him, neither fearful nor mournful, but profound. He felt as if he had stepped into a sacred chamber where grief and gratitude had been laid bare. The emptiness was holy, charged with every moment the fox had spent at this spot, each hour she had borne her pain, each beat of her heart offering solace to a man she had never truly known. Harlan sank to his knees in the snow, bowing his head. He pressed his gloved hands against the earth where she had lain. He felt a warmth lingering in the frozen ground, as though her spirit still pulsed beneath the surface. He remembered every detail, the way her head had lifted when he approached, the way her eyes had shone with recognition, the soft exhale of breath that had mirrored his own. He remembered the trembling hope that each morning she would greet him once more, and the ache that had followed when dawn revealed emptiness instead. A sharp wind rattled the branches overhead, stirring loose snow into swirling motes around him. Harlan shivered but did not rise. He raised his gaze to the cross and imagined the fox's final glance, her last act of devotion. He pictured her walking that path through the pines one final time, every step a farewell, every drop of blood a testament to the promise she had kept. He closed his eyes against the sting of tears. "I thought you'd stay," he whispered. "I thought, but you had to go." A single sunbeam pierced the gray sky, illuminating the clearing in quiet glory. The snow sparkled like a sea of diamonds. For a moment, Harlan felt the weight of loss give way to something gentler, acceptance. He had witnessed a miracle of gratitude, a devotion that transcended fear and mortality. He rose slowly, brushing snow from his coat. His legs trembled, but his heart felt unburdened by grief. He laid one hand on the cross and, voice soft yet steadfast, spoke the words he knew would carry the power of their story beyond this frozen wood. If your heart is racing now, you feel it too. Then subscribe to the channel. Here, we tell the truth. Harlan lingered a moment longer, eyes closed, as though listening for her silent reply. Then he turned and walked back down the path, leaving the clearing in its sacred stillness, knowing that, though her body was gone, the fox's vigil would echo in his soul forever. Harlan sat in the fading light of late afternoon, his breath curling in little spirals before him as he stared at the worn wooden cross. He replayed every moment of the past week in his mind, the first sight of blood on the snow, the fox curled at the foot of the grave, the tins of sardines left half-eaten in tender ceremony, the storms he'd weathered beside her silent vigil, and the small white flower she'd carried in her jaws. Each memory felt both impossibly vivid and somehow unreal, like a dream he could not wake from. Doubt gnawed at him. He whispered to the empty air, "Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe I imagined the stories I've told myself." His voice cracked with the weight of uncertainty. He argued with himself, a wounded fox surviving harsh winters. An animal returning night after night to the same spot. It all seemed beyond belief. Yet every time he thought of dismissing it, a chill ran down his spine, and he felt that familiar tremor in his chest. "Why do I get goosebumps just thinking about it?" he muttered under his breath. "Why do I still stand here, night after night, peering into the woods and waiting?" He shook his head, tears pricking at his eyes. He imagined the fox's amber gaze, wise and unwavering, and he knew he could never truly let go of this mystery. Before dusk settled fully, Harlan grabbed his lantern and wrapped himself in his heaviest coat. The sky was a slate gray, and the first stars blinked faintly overhead as he made his way through the snow toward Sam's grave. His steps were slow and deliberate, each crunch of snow underfoot echoing in the hush of the forest. The wind was calm tonight, a welcome reprieve after the storms that had battered the pines these past days. When he reached the clearing, the sight that greeted him was achingly familiar. The cross stood straight and unwavering, and at its base lay the faintest impression of a body in the snow. He held up the lantern and saw the outlines of where the fox had rested, a perfect shape pressed into the drifts. His heart tightened at the sight. He set the lantern down and sat on a nearby rock, pulled his cap low, and clasped his gloved hands together. The deepening twilight painted the clearing in shades of sapphire and gray. He closed his eyes and spoke aloud, as if Sam himself stood beside him. "I don't know if you can hear me," he said, voice soft in the stillness. "I don't know if she's really out there, or if I'm just a broken old man chasing ghosts. But I feel it in my bones, she came here for more than food or shelter. She came to say goodbye." He paused, his chest tight. The air was so cold that each breath felt like shards of ice on his tongue. Yet he felt no hurry to leave. The clearing felt holy, a sacred space carved out by grief and gratitude. Harlan took a deep breath, memories flooding back of Sam's gentle hands wrapping that broken fox kit in a blanket, of warm lantern light dancing in the dark, of the shy creature returning again and again to repay a kindness. He spoke as though addressing both friend and fox. "She came not for me," he said, voice quavering with emotion. "She came for you, Sam. Not to comfort the living, but to honor your spirit, her old friend who once saved her life." A hush settled over the clearing. In that moment, Harlan felt a presence, as if the forest itself acknowledged his words. He dared to lift his head and look into the tree line, half expecting to see the fox emerge. But there was only shadow and snow. He let his shoulders slump. Then, in a quiet resolve, he whispered, "I don't know what it was. But I'm not the same man I was a week ago. I understand now that animals feel more than we give them credit for. They understand kindness. They remember it. And they forgive." The lantern's glow flickered, casting long, wandering shadows across the snow. He stood and approached the cross, running a hand along its rough-hewn surface. The wood was cold, but beneath his glove he felt the warmth of memory, of moments shared between a fox and a hunter, two lives intertwined by compassion. He knelt and placed his forehead against the base of the cross, closing his eyes. His breath slowed as tears finally broke free, tracing warm paths down his cheeks. He thought of the fox lying there in her final vigil, of her courage in pain, and of the promise she had honored until her last breath. Rising, he retrieved a scrap of paper and ink from his coat pocket, something he'd carried on each visit but never used until now. With careful strokes, he scrawled a few words on the page, in memory of Sam, who showed mercy where others would not. In honor of the fox who returned to bid farewell. He tied the note to the cross with a piece of twine, then stepped back. The forest held its breath as a gentle breeze stirred the snowflakes. Harlan watched until the note snapped softly in the wind. Then he turned and began the long walk back to his cabin, the lantern's light bobbing like a heartbeat in the night. Back inside, he hung his coat by the door and stared at the empty hearth. For a moment, he allowed himself to believe that the fox's spirit might still be watching over him. He thought of the countless times he had doubted, and of the unshakable conviction that had taken root in his heart. As he blew out the single candle he'd lit for Sam, his final words echoed in the quiet room. "I saw a wild fox, wounded and dying, come to the grave of the man who once saved her. She lay down beside him, silent and reverent. And if you think animals do not remember, you simply haven't seen this. But I have." He extinguished the candle's flame, leaving only the soft glow of moonlight through the window. In the darkness, he felt a profound peace settle over him, a peace born of witnessing something beyond explanation, beyond fear, beyond loss. And though the fox would no longer appear, her vigil had changed him forever. If you've ever encountered a miracle in the wild, right, animals remember kindness.
When I saw that red muzzle poking out of the snowdrift, my heart stopped, because I realized she was looking not like a wild animal, but like a person. I had been trudging through knee-deep drifts all morning, my breath freezing in the air, every branch weighed down by the recent blizzard. I'm a forest ranger, 60 years old, and I've lived alone in that creaking cabin for more than a decade. I know every footstep, every snapping twig in these woods, yet nothing prepared me for that silent pause. I spotted her when I rounded the fallen pine, her body half buried and shivering. At first, I thought she was dead. But then I saw her trembling leg, caught fast in a rusty old steel trap, the skin broken and blood seeping into the pristine white. Ordinarily, I would have finished her quickly, to end the suffering, but something stopped me. She lifted her head and met my gaze. No snarling, no desperate snaps of her jaws. Just two dark eyes, glistening with pain and something deeper, recognition, maybe compassion. I knelt, every muscle screaming from the cold, and whispered, "I'm sorry, friend," even though I didn't know what real friends felt like anymore. I pulled my leather gloves off with jerking fingers and pried the trap open, ignoring the cut on my palm. She lay still, but I felt her lean into my touch as I freed her paw. There was no struggle, only that soft trust dangling in the heavy air. I tore strips from my own coat, wrapped her wound, and stuffed a chunk of cured pork fat into her numb mouth. She ate it, slow and deliberate, as if tasting both mercy and memory. Then she rose, wobbly but determined. I half expected her to bolt into the forest, to vanish like a phantom, leaving me alone with guilt and questions. But she paused about 10 paces away, turned her head slightly, and looked back. Her eyes bore into mine, I could almost feel her pulse. As though she was saying thank you, or perhaps promising something I couldn't yet understand. I thought that was the end. When spring thawed the last of the snow, I thought that terrible winter was finally behind me. Ice melted from the creek. Buds unfurled on the birch. My aching joints felt lighter, and with them, my mind. The red fox, her image, slipped into memory like a dream unraveling at dawn. My twins arrived soon after, Lily and Sam, 6 years old, wild with laughter and muddy boots. I greeted them at the cabin door, their small hands reaching for mine. I hadn't seen their bright faces since Christmas, and for the first time in months, I felt something like hope bloom in my chest. We spent that first week in a whirl of simple joys. I showed them how to build a lean-to from fallen branches. We layered pine boughs for a floor and dragged scraps of tarp across the roof. Their eyes shone as they tucked in straw and dry leaves, chattering about secret forts and hidden treasure. Every evening, I fried pancakes on the old cast-iron skillet, thick, buttery, dotted with wild berries we found on the trail. We ate them dripping with syrup under a canopy of budding maples, our laughter echoing through the pale green woods. During the day, I taught them to track small animals. I showed Lily how to follow deer tracks, heel pad, 3 toes. Sam learned the difference between squirrel and rabbit prints. They crouched low, their faces inches from the dirt, breath coming in excited puffs. I was proud to see their confidence grow with every step. Then, one afternoon, I caught a flash of orange at the edge of the clearing. A fleeting silhouette, so quick I wondered if it was a trick of light through the leaves. I stopped mid-scoop, pancake in hand, and squinted. The world fell silent except for the drip of melting water and the twins' delighted chatter. "Grandpa," Lily whispered, "look over there." She pointed. There, at the far end of our makeshift playground, a slender shape crouched beneath a young pine. Its coat was the same burnished red I'd seen that winter. For a heartbeat, it stared at us with eyes too steady to be normal. Then it vanished into the green shadows. My heart skipped. Rabies could make any animal fearless, even aggressive. I stepped forward, pancake forgotten, scanning the tree line. "Stay close," I ordered, my voice tighter than I intended. The twins obeyed, puzzled by the change in my tone. She's just looking," Sam said, tilting his head. "She's not running away." I swallowed, trying to steady myself. It made no sense. Wild creatures usually fled at our scent. Yet this one, she lingered. I forced a laugh. Probably just a hungry fox. But even as I said it, I doubted the explanation. That night, I lay awake listening to the forest hum back to life. Somewhere beyond the window, an owl called once, and frogs began their chorus. I stared at the ceiling, thinking of that gaze. Instead of malice or fear, there was something almost knowing. I shook my head. I was letting the past creep back in, infect my peace. The next morning, I checked the areas where I'd seen her shadow. No trap, nothing. Just broken branches and tracks half erased by fallen petals. I made coffee stronger than usual and forced down 2 pancakes before bundling the kids into their boots. We needed to forget about foxes. But as we walked the trail I'd cleared, I caught sight of those tracks again, 4 tiny ovals, then a larger pad, repeating in a steady line. They led toward the deeper forest, as if inviting us in. I knelt to inspect them, tracing the shape with my finger. "What do you think?" I asked Lily. She shrugged, eyes bright. "She's curious, Grandpa. Like you taught me." I smiled, heart twisting. I had taught her to read these signs, and now those signs were pointing toward danger. My pulse quickened. What if the fox circled back tonight? What if hunger or something darker drove her to close the distance between us? I forced myself to stand. "Let's head home," I said. My voice sounded hollow, even to me. The twins looked disappointed, but they followed without question. That evening, the forest whispered around my cabin. I checked the door latch twice. I propped an extra log beside the wood stove, just in case. Sleep came in fits. Each time I closed my eyes, I saw that flash of red and those unblinking eyes. I didn't give it much thought. I wish I had. When I led Lily and Sam into the woods that morning, sun dappled our path through fresh green leaves and the promise of morels waiting beneath the oaks. I told them to stay close, but after a while I glanced back and realized they'd scampered ahead, their laughter fading into the quiet of the forest. I called, "Easy now," and they waved, sprinting a few paces down the trail as if racing invisible rivals. I paused by a mossy stump to point out the telltale brown caps of the mushrooms peeking through the ferns. By the time I looked up, they were gone. The trail ahead lay empty, the foot-worn path swallowed by shadows and new undergrowth. My throat tightened. "Lily? Sam?" My voice trembled, cracking like old bark. Silence answered. I stepped forward, heart thundering, scanning between trunks as the sun shifted overhead. No bright jackets, no quick footsteps. I called again, louder, "Lily. Sam." The forest's only reply was the distant drip of sap and a lone jay's harsh cry. Panic bloomed in my chest. I ran back along the trail, calling out, my boots thudding on soft earth. The morels were forgotten. I searched every hollow log, every stand of ferns. My pulse hammered in my ears until it drowned out the world. By midday, I realized they were truly missing. I fished my phone from my coat, odd, how unfriendly its screen felt against my cold fingers, and dialed for help. The voice on the other end promised firefighters, search and rescue teams would be there soon. I hung up and sank to a fallen log, head in my hands, tasting the acrid bitterness of dread. As the afternoon waned, helicopters droned overhead. Flashlights danced through the trees. I trudged beside rescuers, offering what little clues I had. Tracks, a pair of small footprints beside mine, ended abruptly at a damp patch of moss. Then nothing. My own footprints trailed onward, but the twins' prints vanished as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Night fell with a sudden hush. We spread out with our beams, white arcs cutting through the black. I stayed near the center, calling their names until my voice echoed unrecognizable. My legs shook, exhaustion pooling in my bones. I could feel the weight of every second that slipped away. Somewhere ahead, a light winked, a flashlight bobbing through the trees. I sprinted toward it, breath ragged. Two figures emerged, rescuers, not my children. Disappointment crashed into me, rawer than fear. Alongside them, the woods breathed. Each exhale of wind sounded like a warning. And then, for a moment, I thought I saw them, Lily's braid of golden hair catching the beam, Sam's small frame crouched by a fern. But when I lunged, there was nothing but empty air and drifting leaves. My heart sank so low it felt like it might stop. I sank to my knees, fists gripping soil, eyes stinging. It felt as if the forest itself held its breath. Every crack of a twig, every distant call of an unseen bird prickled my nerves. I swear, I could feel the ground pulsing, alive with tension and unspoken secrets. In that charged silence, I sensed a presence, another pair of eyes watching me. Not human eyes, though. Something wild. I turned, expecting to see a deer or maybe a fox. But nothing moved, just the hush of pines and the cold stare of midnight shadows. My chest tightened until it felt like stone. "Where are you?" I whispered, voice broken. I had kept them in my sight for only a moment. I should never have let them go ahead, even for a second. As the rescuers called me back to the clearing, I stumbled, head spinning. They urged me forward, but I just stood there, stunned. I thought this was the end, I muttered to myself, voice hollow, as if admitting it might have been the truth. When dawn broke, the sky was still leaden and low, but a fresh blanket of snow had fallen overnight, so fine it sifted like flour from the heavens. I stepped outside, boots crunching the powder, and for a moment I tasted hope. The twins would be safe, found at first light. I followed the path back into the woods, calling Lily and Sam's names, my breath curling in the cold air. That's when I saw them, two tiny boot prints, perfectly formed in the virgin snow. My heart lurched, those were the twins. I exhaled, relief warming me, until I looked closer. Beside each child's print was another set, delicate, paw-shaped imprints, 4 toes and a slanted pad, fox tracks. They ran side by side, shoulder to shoulder, as if an unseen guide had accompanied my grandchildren through the white silence. My throat closed. In all my years as a ranger, I had never seen anything like it. Predators stalk, prey flees, but here was proof that something had walked with them, step for step, into the deeper forest. Logic shattered around me. My pulse pounded so hard I thought the ground itself would tremble. I bent low, tracing the outline of the fox print with a gloved fingertip. Around us, the world was impossibly still, the trees bowed under the snow, and the only sound was the whisper of my ragged breathing. I swallowed, tasting cold fear. Despite every instinct screaming for caution, I pressed on, following the twin pairs of tracks deeper beneath the pines. The fox prints never led or followed, they mirrored the children's every footfall, turning when they turned, pausing when they paused. It was as though the animal had walked in solidarity, an escort through dangers I could barely imagine. Twice I halted, convinced I must be imagining it. But the grooves in the snow were too sharp, too deliberate. I knelt again to inspect a print, long, slender toes, claws retracted, a silent, thoughtful footprint. My breath misted as I studied it. How could a wild creature choose to walk with us, protect us, when its very nature was survival at cost to others? Minutes stretched into an eternity as I followed those tracks until they splintered at the edge of a dense thicket. There, the children's prints veered left, toward an old fallen spruce, but the fox prints, and there were more than one set now, as if others had joined, swung around the trunk, forming a protective arc. My chest tightened so fiercely it felt like ice. Every nerve in my body screamed that this was impossible. Yet there they were, in living proof under my gaze. I stood, snow crunching under my boots, and peered through the branches, expecting to see a vixen watching me, or perhaps Lily and Sam huddled together. But all I saw was swirling white. Somewhere ahead, the tracks continued, deeper still, into a part of the forest I had avoided since the winter began, dark hollows and ice-crusted hollows where even deer hesitated. And yet, the footprints beckoned me onward, as though they held the promise of finding my children safe and sound. I swallowed past the knot in my throat and took another step. My mind raced with questions. Why would a fox do this? Why now, and why for my grandchildren? Was it the same vixen I'd freed from the trap in the blizzard? Had she come back to repay a debt I scarcely understood? The forest around me seemed to lean in, branches scratching at the sky, and I felt that ancient, wild intelligence watching, judging, guiding. My heart thundered so loudly I thought it might burst. The children's prints and the fox's intertwined led me forward, and with every step, disbelief gnawed at me. I could not fathom how any creature of fang and claw could show such compassion. And yet, here it was, traced in snow as clear as any promise. I took a shaky breath, squared my shoulders, and plunged into the thicket, determined to follow those impossible tracks to whatever lay beyond. I didn't understand how such a thing could be possible. When the sun rode high in the sky and the chill of morning had long since faded, I finally spotted the clearing. An ancient spruce lay uprooted, its roots twisting into the air like the fingers of some buried giant. Beneath the tangle of branches, I saw the shape of a makeshift shelter, a crude hut of dry sticks and woven twigs, draped with moss and littered with soft hay. My heart thundered so loud I thought the earth might tremble. I sprinted forward, branches scraping my coat, breath burning in my lungs. Through a narrow gap in the wall, I peered inside, and froze. There they were, Lily and Sam, curled up together on the bed of golden straw. Their cheeks were flushed with warmth, their small bodies covered in a patchwork of moss and pine needles. They slept soundly, chests rising and falling in peaceful rhythm. Around them, the faint scent of wildflowers and wood smoke clung to the air. I stumbled into the shelter, dropping to my knees. "Lily, Sam," I whispered, voice cracking. They stirred, blinking up at me with sleepy, bright eyes. "Grandpa." Lily sat up, brushing damp hair from her face. "We're okay. The fox brought us here. She covered us." Sam nodded, too calm for a child who had gone missing in the woods for half a day. "She licked our hands, then built this. She stayed until we slept." My throat tightened so fiercely it felt as though someone had gripped it with iron fingers. I reached out, gently touching Sam's shoulder. His skin was warm, alive, and in his gaze I saw no hint of the terror I had felt. In their voices, there was no fear. Only trust. I scrambled outside to the tree's uprooted root ball, heart pounding. There, pressed into the damp earth, were their boot prints, and alongside each one, the fox's delicate tracks. I bent to examine the shelter's roof, tiny, bristly red hairs caught in the bark, glowing bright against the pale wood. My mind reeled. After everything I'd thought I knew about wild animals, about instincts and self-preservation, here was proof that a creature of fang and fur had chosen to protect my grandchildren. The same vixen I had rescued from that trap last winter had come back, guiding them through the forest's hazards and fashioning a haven beneath the fallen tree. Tears pricked my eyes as I knelt beside the tracks. Each paw print was so precise, no hesitation in their pattern, no stray claw marks, only purpose. She had walked with them, step for step, leading them to safety. I thought, this is it. This impossible kindness must be the end. I must have been granted mercy twice, once when I freed her from iron jaws, and now when she shielded my children from harm. I crouched by the shelter's entrance, wiping snow off a tuft of moss. My breath came ragged. I imagined the fox's silhouette, slender against the sky, her tail curled around her feet as she watched over them. I wanted to believe that that was all, I murmured to myself, voice thick with wonder. But the forest had more to say. When I left the children safely in the cabin, clutching Sam's jacket as he rubbed sleep from his eyes, I felt as though I were moving through a dream. The forest seemed unnaturally still, every branch and blade of grass frozen in suspense. I told myself I needed to see her one more time, not out of curiosity, but out of gratitude, and perhaps to still the tremor in my bones. I followed the old logging road, now little more than 2 ruts carved into moss and leaf litter. The late afternoon sun filtered through the budding canopy, casting golden lattices across my path. With every step, my mind replayed the morning's miracle, how she had guided Lily and Sam to that hollow shelter, how she had tended to them as though they were her own. Then, on a gentle rise ahead, I saw her. She stood motionless atop a moss-covered knoll, backlit by shafts of light that made her coat glow like embers. She did not flee. She did not shrink into the shadows. She simply watched me, poised as though she had been waiting. My breath caught, and I realized I had stopped walking. My boots pressed into the soft earth, unmoving. All at once, the air felt too wide, the world too vast. I took a cautious step forward, and in response, she turned her head, a graceful arc, and fixed her gaze on me. Her ears pricked, alert, and I felt that ancient bond hum between us, a thread woven through fate and memory. I rushed the last few paces until we were less than a dozen strides apart. She made no move to escape. Instead, she stepped closer, narrowing the space between us to barely a body's length. My heart hammered so mercilessly that I thought the sound would shatter the quiet. I swallowed past the lump in my throat and watched as she settled onto her haunches in the soft moss, every muscle relaxed yet impossibly alert. She sat there, eyes locked on mine, and for a long moment, neither of us stirred. The forest held its breath, too, the birds silent, the wind stilled. I peered into her eyes and felt the world flip upside down. There was no wild ferocity there, no hungry cunning or savage instinct. There was only something deeper, something startlingly human, compassion, gratitude, perhaps even recognition. I sank to one knee, my gloved hand hovering over my heart. My voice came out in a hoarse whisper, "Was that you?" The words felt inadequate, as though language itself could never capture the magnitude of what I'd witnessed. Her eyes did not blink. Then, almost imperceptibly, her head tipped in a slow, deliberate nod. Or maybe I imagined it. Perhaps it was my own longing shaping the motion. Yet in that instant, I believed with every fiber of my being that she was telling me, yes. It was me, the one you saved. Then, as silently as she had arrived, she rose, and backed away a step. She turned and melted into the underbrush, her tail the last trace of flame against the green gloom. I remained on my knees, watching until she vanished completely, until only the hush of the forest filled the space between the trees. I stayed there for a long while, unmoving, as if rooted to the spot. My pulse finally slowed, but a tremor lingered in my limbs. I placed a hand on the moss where she had sat, a gentle, living carpet, and felt its cool dampness against my palm. I whispered to the empty woods, "I've never seen eyes like that on a wild creature. Only on people." No answer came but the distant call of a jay and the soft creak of growing branches. I rose unsteadily, uncertain whether I had truly seen what I knew I had. I carried that image of her gaze with me down the trail, burnished, knowing, impossibly wise. I walked back to the cabin as dusk settled, shadows twisting between the trees. I passed the spot where Lily and Sam had first disappeared, and my throat tightened again at the memory of their frightened cries. But that fear was already eclipsed by something larger, wonder, reverence, and a question that would haunt me. I could not tell a soul what had happened. Who would believe that a fox looked at me as an equal? That she repaid a man's mercy with her own? I pressed my hand to the pocket where I kept the tuft of red fur I'd found in episode 5, tracing its fine strands. I knew what I had to do, keep the secret safe, tucked away like a treasure in my heart. I never spoke of it again. Yet every now and then, when the wind shifts just so and the moonlight filters through the pines, I swear I see her silhouette on that knoll, watching. And I remember that impossible nod, an affirmation from the wild that even the smallest act of kindness can echo through a lifetime. I was thumbing through the leather-bound journal that night, tracing my finger over the faded Polaroids from that terrible winter day. There I was, kneeling in the snow beside her, my gloved hand still poised over the trap. Behind me, half hidden in the blurry background, I could swear I saw a flash of red fur. I paused, heart hammering, and zoomed in on the photograph. Sure enough, in the corner of the frame, a pair of dark eyes gleamed against the white drifts. I leaned back in my chair, the old cabin creaking around me, and let the memory wash over me. The fire crackled in the stove, and outside, my old hound Rufus stirred in his bed by the door. I listened as the wind rattled the shutters, thinking I'd finally put the day to rest. But then, the dogs began to bark, a wild, frantic chorus that shattered the quiet. Rufus bolted upright, hackles raised, and lunged for the door. I dropped the journal and dashed outside, boots slapping the wooden steps. There, in the moonlit yard, I saw her again. The vixen stood just beyond the fence, her red coat luminous under the lantern light. Rufus charged at her, snarling, fangs bared, driven by instinct. I called his name, but he wouldn't listen. He was a protector, and she was an intruder in his domain. I wrenched Rufus back by the collar, heart in my throat. The dog snarled and snapped at the air, trying to break free. For a moment, the fox held her ground, her posture neither aggressive nor fearful, just calm, resolute. When I finally hauled Rufus away, she melted into the shadows, and the barking ceased as abruptly as it had begun. I stood panting in the yard, Rufus trembling at my side, and the world felt unnaturally still. A sickening thought stabbed me: what if everything had happened differently? What if I hadn't hesitated over that trap last winter? What if I'd done what I thought was right, ended her suffering, and never spared her a second thought? My reflection in the cabin window showed an old man haunted by guilt. I pressed my hand against the glass, feeling the tremor in my fingers. In that moment, I realized that the fox's return was no accident of fate or curiosity, it was a debt repaid. She hadn't come for revenge, she had come to save. She had come again. A rush of warmth spread through me as I looked up at the dark sky. The snow began to fall in gentle flakes, each one dissolving on my coat. Somehow, in that instant, the forest felt forgiving. I knelt and stroked Rufus's head, murmuring, "She's not your enemy." I straightened and scanned the edge of the yard, but she was gone, vanished like a wisp of smoke. I leaned against the fence, the cold wood grounding me, and whispered into the night, "Thank you." For a long moment, I thought that was the end, my debt to nature repaid, my children safe, my conscience eased. But the forest does not speak in final words. When late autumn's chill first bit the air, I felt a pull I could no longer ignore. The maples had shed their leaves, and frost glazed the porch boards like fragile glass. I stepped outside at dawn, heart heavy with gratitude and awe, and there, on the gentle rise beyond the clearing, she waited. But she was no longer the bright russet vixen I had known. Her muzzle was flecked with silver, her coat muted by time and countless seasons. At her side stood two lithe, curious kits, their fur still touched by the fire of youth. They watched me with unblinking eyes, as if acknowledging a debt they did not owe. For a heartbeat, I held my breath. Then I bowed my head deeply, the crisp air pricking my cheeks. In that silent gesture, our worlds met, hunter turned guardian, wild turned family. The kids stepped closer, their small paws nudging against their mother's side, but she remained statuesque, regal, as though presiding over a ceremony I could barely comprehend. I felt the weight of her purpose in every line of her worn frame. She had repaid a kindness not with violence or fear, but with life and loyalty. She had shown me her world, and welcomed me into it. And then, as the sun broke through the clouds, she rose. With one last glance, she dipped her head in a motion so deliberate it stole my breath. It was a farewell bow. Like a person who says, "I remember." When I looked up again, they were gone, mere shadows among the trees, leaving only footprints and an echo of wonder in the clearing. I stepped inside the cabin and paused at the threshold. The cedar door creaked behind me, shutting out the crisp autumn air, and for a moment the only sound was the crackle of the wood stove. Lily and Sam were sprawled on the braided rug before the hearth, their laughter drifting like smoke rings through the low-ceilinged room. They were building tiny forts out of scrap wood and pine cones, pretending they were explorers charting unknown lands. My boots thudded softly on the floorboards as I crossed the room. I hadn't realized how hollow the silence felt until their voices filled the space. The twins didn't notice me at first, so absorbed were they in their game. Then Lily looked up, her eyes bright as autumn skies, and called, "Grandpa, look." Sam piped in, "We made a castle." I smiled, but my heart felt too large for my chest. Every log's crack and every pop from the stove sounded like an echo of that forest miracle. Outside, the world could still be wild and indifferent. Inside, these two children were safe. I sank onto the edge of the worn armchair and watched them. Their cheeks were rosy from the day's play. Sam scraped splinters from a pine cone. Lily lined up miniature acorn caps around a stick wall. I remembered half a day ago, wandering through drifts of snow and branches, my soul plummeting with fear. And now, here they were, as alive and laughing as any two children on earth. A warmth spread through me, as if the cabin itself recognized the wonder. I closed my eyes and felt the same hush I'd felt beneath that upturned tree when I first found them. The hush that had become a promise. I opened my eyes and whispered to the empty room. "That doesn't happen. That can't happen." But I saw it. I stood before a wild creature, and it was kinder than many people. My voice trembled on the last words, and for a heartbeat I thought the walls would lean in to catch my confession. I rose and moved closer to the stove, feeling its heat on my face. The children paused and watched me curiously, sensing something important had passed between us. The wood popped again, and I drew in a ragged breath. I glanced at the photograph above the mantel, a snapshot of frostbitten trees and that trap I'd pried open. In the corner of the frame, almost hidden, lay her soft muzzle against my snow-caked glove. I ran a finger over the cracked glass. In every season that had turned since then, I'd questioned my own memory. Now I knew. My gaze drifted back to Lily and Sam. I cleared my throat. "You know," I said gently, "sometimes the forest speaks in ways we can't explain." They looked up, exchanging a glance. Sam shrugged and asked, "Like magic?" Lily nodded seriously, "Like real magic." I chuckled, something raw and relieved bubbling in my chest. "Yes. Like real magic." I crossed to the door and pulled it open an inch. A breeze slipped in, curling around their little forts. I closed my eyes and let it brush my face, hearing again the whistle of wind through pine and the soft padding of tiny paws in snow. I turned back to the children and let the moment swell. If your heart is racing right now, you understand. Subscribe to the channel. Here they tell the truth. Their eyes widened at the odd words, and I laughed, remembering the instruction that had fallen into my mind as naturally as leaves in fall. I knelt beside them and ruffled their hair. They giggled, and I felt tears prick at my lids. "Grandpa, you're silly," Lily said. Sam giggled too, and for a moment I forgot what it was like to doubt. But I couldn't hold on to the magic forever, not in words or laughter alone. Something in me demanded a final offering, a way to share the wonder without unraveling its mystery. I stood and walked to the hearth, gathering a handful of burning ember. I laid them on a flat stone near the fire, no flame beyond the stove, just warm glow, and whispered one last summons. If you also believe in a special bond with animals, right, we are not alone in this world. I let the ember die to ash, and the room settled back into its quiet comfort. Lily and Sam returned to their fort, stacking pine cones with newfound seriousness, as if they understood the gravity of my odd little ritual. I watched them for a moment longer, soaking in their trust, their unguarded joy. Outside, the sky was a pale wash of gold through frosted windows. The world beyond the cabin still held shadows and hidden depths, but inside, in that small circle of warmth and laughter, everything that truly mattered was plain as day. I raked wood into the stove and closed the door behind me, sealing in the echoes of their voices. I rose early the next morning and found fresh fox tracks in the frost by the porch steps, single, clear prints leading into the woods, as if an old friend had come to say goodbye. I followed them a few paces, but they vanished under a blanket of fallen leaves. I turned and walked back to the cabin, the windows glowing behind me. In that soft light, I felt no fear, only a quiet expectation. Perhaps one day she would return. Perhaps she already had, in footprints no man could forge and in moments no eye could see. For now, I stood at the threshold of the world I knew and the world I had been shown, a world where kindness is its own language and where the wild can be, if only we believe, the kindest of all.